That's not the case nationwide. Nationwide, we saw probably the worst example was out on the West Coast in California. It took them 6 months to count their ballots.
Right.
Now, I could have counted every single California ballot in much briefer time than 6 months, all by myself.
This Up to Speed podcast is made possible by Legislative Solutions. Legislative Solutions knows New Hampshire's politics inside and out. With years of experience and a results-driven approach, they're the go-to team for anyone looking to make an impact at the State House. Find them at legislative-solutions.com. Welcome to Up to Speed. I'm Michael Graham with New Hampshire Journal. Up to Speed is designed to bring you up to speed on what's happening here in New Hampshire in the sectors of our community that you care about, brought to you by our friends at Legislative Solutions. So thus far on Up to Speed, we've talked about parts of the commercial sector in New Hampshire. What about civic life? What if we got, say, a former U.S. ambassador, a member of Congress, and a former U.S. senator, a member of Congress, to talk about the health of our democracy? Let's do it right now. We have former U.S. Senator John Sununu, former ambassador and Congressman Dick Swett to talk about Senator Sununu, the Democracy Defense Project. Is that right?
That is correct. Yeah. Democracy Defense Project was put together at the end of 2023 to focus on public confidence and the integrity of the election process, not just in New Hampshire, but all over the country. The focus has been on some of the bigger, more competitive states as we went into the 2024 elections. In the last two election cycles, both very close, competitive, and not without controversy. And I think that the thought was, look, let's put together a bipartisan organization, not advocating for or against pieces of legislation, but just talking about how elections should work, right? What works well. What are the elements in the election process that give people confidence, and also perhaps identify some of the issues that cause more questions or that maybe should be addressed. So Ambassador Swett and I are the co-chairs for New Hampshire. There are co-chairs in 7 or 8 other states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Virginia, but the focus is here, right, on New Hampshire.
Right.
What do we do well? How does the process work? So we've spent time, obviously, talking to elected officials, working with the Secretary of the State, doing op-eds, writing about our perspective of the election process. And it's been a good experience. I think it's been successful, but the concept wasn't do this for 6 months. The folks who helped put DDP together thought, no, this is a multi-year effort,
right?
Because it's about education, and in some cases, it's about improving best practices, and those things don't happen overnight. The last thing I'd say is we had good fortune here in New Hampshire, and that after the 2020 elections, the Secretary of State put together a working group, traveled all over New Hampshire, and Ambassador Swett was one of the co-chairs of the group. So we had a really good foundation of information and discussion about this topic to start with. And as a co-chair, it's made my job much easier.
So you've been an ambassador, you've been a member of Congress. Dick Swett, I'm going to ask you to play doctor. What is not that way. What is the condition of the democracy in New Hampshire and across America? What kind of shape is our patient in your opinion?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having us on so that we can have this conversation. And John did a great job in giving a broad brush description of what we're trying to do. But I would say the national condition of the national patient is critical. I think in New Hampshire, we're pretty well off. We're pretty healthy state. But it was interesting, when I traveled around the state, we had 9 different hearings. We took over 40 hours of public hearing testimony. What I found was that there was a lack of confidence based on the concerns that exist in the rest of the country. And New Hampshire was looking at what ultimately turned out to mainly be human error, right, to be as some kind of conspiracy theory or some kind of setup that one group or another was trying to manipulate the elections. And that's not the case in New Hampshire. But nationally, what we are trying to do is we're trying to not only suggest that others follow the example that New Hampshire has set, but also to establish a transparent process through which people see exactly what's going on in their elections, know that their vote counts, know that the results of their collective votes come to a point of a democratic solution to
Right.
who takes the next office. And these are all things that I think are critically important to building back the trust in our government that much of the public has lost over the last few decades. So this is something that we think is very important and that we have committed ourselves to. We focused initially in the 7 battleground states, and we saw in this last election that all of those states collected and counted their votes very, very transparently, openly, and accurately. Now we're looking at how do we broaden this educational process to the entire country.
So, Dr. Sununu, would you concur on the status of the patient critical?
Broadly speaking, yes. Let's talk a little bit about New Hampshire, and then I'll highlight a couple of the weaknesses that I see. But I think Ambassador Swett and I generally very much agree on these issues. What are the fundamentals in New Hampshire? Right? Everyone has a paper ballot.
Right.
So right there, any auditing, recounting, etc., much easier, much more straightforward, but also transparent. We have counting machines, not voting machines. We have electronic counting machines to help with the counting of the paper ballots, and those
not connected to any internet.
Yeah, right. None of them are connected to the internet. They're obviously tested and calibrated. And in a recent meeting with the Secretary of State, he highlighted that the movement is and will continue to be to units that use open source software. We count all of our ballots, within 24 hours of the election, as we're required to do by state law. So the focus has been and will continue to be on transparency, consistency, and even as we introduce new technology, our town, Rye, has introduced a scan for your ID when you go to try to accelerate the process. It's been fairly successful, but as we've seen in many cases around the world, just because it's technology doesn't mean it's perfect, and you want to make sure it's implemented well. Because again, a failure of implementation, even if it's just human error, makes people a little less confident in the process. So
let's talk about. I'm sorry. Let's talk about human error for a second, because I think that's a key.
Yeah.
Because in my misspent youth, I ran campaigns for a living. And one of the things you learn is that the reason our system works is confidence. People just feel confident that if they drive down to the polls, put the thing in, that they're going to count. Now, that confidence obviously took some blows for all sorts of reasons over the past decade. And the question is, how do you restore confidence? And I want to give an example out of New Hampshire that I think amplifies around the country. In the town of Bedford, you had an unfortunate situation where a tray of ballots simply weren't counted. That's a thing. The problem, it appeared after the fact, was that the town officials, the manager, tried to hide that fact. They didn't let people know. They sent out a letter mysteriously. Then when they were confronted by NHJournal, they didn't want to answer questions. And then they had another screw up. Later, they found another envelope full of ballots. And what my political consultant brain was thinking was what you just said, Senator Sununu. Transparency. Just stop saying nothing went wrong.
So let me great points.
That's my question for you: is part of the responsibility for the declining confidence the people who are in charge basically trying to tell the voters, just sit down, shut up, you don't know what you're talking about, there are no problems, and voters going, well, actually there are some problems.
So let me highlight two things, and then Ambassador Swett has done a lot of work in this area in particular, right? So what can you do about that, right? There's this competence, right, that affects confidence in some cases, and we shouldn't suggest that it's common in the least, even in New Hampshire or anywhere else. But obviously, a significant mistake that's mishandled to compound the mistake can have ripple effects. So two important things here. One is training, right? Train the poll workers of all types and levels so that the likelihood of a mistake, which happens, is reduced. And that's something that New Hampshire has focused on. The Secretary of State has focused on. Ambassador Swett can talk more about the details there, not just today, but going back. The second very important effect, and here I'm stealing something that the ambassador has pointed out many times, is the value of having those poll workers be local officials and local volunteers, so that in the event that they compound the error, in your town at least, it is a good thing that you know who that person is. If they're an elected official, they're an elected official, and there's a repercussion for that, and they know that. And that it doesn't mean it should be a threat, but that's why it's important to have local elections and give them local power, so that when there's an issue at the ballot box or in the budget process, we respond and hopefully respond in a thoughtful and effective way.
Well, and I'll add to that. First of all, the senator is absolutely right in all the points that he makes. When he talks about transparency and consistency, I would add two more. I would say intimacy and humility, because you need to have, in the intimacy side, you need to have knowledge of who the moderator is, who the vote counters are in your community. And in New Hampshire, everybody knows everybody, and everybody's a neighbor to the moderator. Everybody's a neighbor to the vote counters and volunteers. And that intimacy makes a huge difference, because when mistakes occur, we're dealing with friends, we're dealing with people that we know and trust. And I think that's a very important foundation upon which to build this voter confidence. The humility is, maybe that's too strong a word, but when there are mistakes that are made, all sides need to look at this not from a point of arrogance or a point of anger, but rather from a point of understanding that this was a human error, because that's what the main problems that New Hampshire voting places have had. And not to, as was pointed out in the Bedford case, to deny a mistake, but rather to come forward and honestly and openly admit that the mistake was made, re-enter those ballots into the system. They never have an impact on the outcome of the election, or almost never. And to do that in such a way that those relationships that are between the people that are running the election and participating and voting in the election are not severed or not damaged, but are rather strengthened and built in a broader understanding. And so those are the ways that we in New Hampshire have dealt successfully with the whole process of the electoral system. That's not the case nationwide. Nationwide, we saw probably the worst example was out on the West Coast in California. It took them 6 months to count their ballots. Now, I could have counted every single California ballot in much briefer time than 6 months, all by myself. So these are the things that really need to be looked at and need to be fixed so that people can believe in their system.
And now let's
and on this topic, I'd add one more thing, though, that there still are a number of states and localities where the poll workers are not local or not elected officials. They're hired often, from outside the voting precinct or the state, for that matter. And I don't think that's a healthy part of the process, because then you have a less accountability if there's a mistake, and less incentive to count the votes as quickly as possible, again, in the way that local representation and local political officials would be, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. It doesn't matter.
And the senator made one comment about training, which I think needs to be amplified. And that is that Secretary of State David Scanlon, has already held over 2,000 training sessions with moderators and election volunteers. And those training sessions do exactly as the senator said. It teaches the volunteers and the moderators how to run the process more openly, more consistently, more transparently. And it also gives them a better and broader understanding of how important it is that their jobs be fulfilled in a proper and consistent way. So over 2,000 training sessions is an impressive number for a small state like New Hampshire. That would be even greater in the bigger states.
And let's give a shout out to a town that I think did handle the problem the right way, which is when Windham had that bizarre situation where folded ballots were misread by the machine because of, once again, no one foresaw it. It just happened. And they did total overkill. Like they brought in experts. They had extended hearings. They showed, it took, once they explained what happened, it took 30 seconds to understand. Oh, okay, I get it. That wasn't good enough. They said, no, we know there are people who have questions. We know there are people who fear conspiracies. We're going to, every angle of this, we're going to cover. And I think you need overkill. And one of the things that I've heard that I've pushed back against is, well, this is all because of politics and Trump and whatever. I said, no, this is because we live in this new social media environment where you see fake things every day. You see videos generated that are funny, but you're like, oh my gosh, you can do that? And so when you live in a climate where it's hard to know literally what is true, I think overkill should be the right response when it comes to convincing people about our democratic process. Do you support overkill, Ambassador Swett?
Well, I wouldn't call it overkill. I would just I would call it greater detail and attention to the problems that the system potentially possesses. That's a very good example. We were dealing with the Windham circumstances in our public hearings right at the beginning of our special committee on voter confidence.
Right.
And one thing that we found out through that was that voter lists themselves and how often they are upgraded and upkept and are cleaned out. The move outs and the deaths are removed and the move ins are added to them. That has been done typically on a 10-year cycle based on the census process. And we think that has to be done much more rapidly, much more readily, much more regularly. The overkill, as you say, Michael, could be every day, every minute.
Sure.
Every year is even a lot. But we believe that the towns that keep their lists up to date and are not doubling up, move in, move outs, deaths, and whatnot on the same address, that eliminates a lot of the concern and a lot of the feelings that there are groups out there that are manipulating that outdated information. So that's important too.
Very much so. And that, I mean, to me, what that represents, right, if you're not doing an effective job of updating those, it's a source of potential controversy, right? That the fact that you might have some number, whether it's 10 or 10,000 names that aren't residents, or maybe names that are deceased, is a potential source of controversy. Even if you can say, well, we have all of those names on the ballot, but don't worry, none of them have voted, in the last 2 election cycles or whatever it might be. That may be true, and that may mean that they weren't used as a source of fraud, but it doesn't change the fact that they're a potential source and a potential source of controversy. So there's value for everyone to use an update process that's as effective as possible, as timely as possible. And again, to the Secretary's credit, it's one of the things that David Scanlon's been focused on and trying to incorporate into his training, right? Training for poll workers, training for town moderators, and training for the clerks that keep the voter rolls themselves. All areas are quite important.
And so one of the things I think as a challenge in this era we just mentioned, the social media era, is your lying eyes problem, which is when people see something right in front of them, it's hard to talk them out of. What do you mean there's no problem? We just had an example that was mentioned during a hearing in the House where a college student received 21 ballots, and someone who was trying to oppose a voting reform said, what's the problem with that? They can only vote once. Well, normal people go, I don't think I want 21 ballots sent to the same person floating around. The other one that I want to ask you about, Ambassador Swett, is the idea of proving citizenship. The argument is, well, very few non-citizens vote. I happen to know for some of the reporting that we've done that the times that illegal immigrants have been registered to vote, often it's not the illegal immigrant who's done it. It's a voter advocacy group who's just trying to get as many names as possible because they're trying to promote vote, maybe for good purposes or maybe for partisan purposes. So it's not necessarily bad actors, but when people see, for example, that you can walk into some places around the country and not show an ID and walk in and vote, and they know there are people in the country illegally, and they know that there are 21 ballots. You put all that together and they see it, to say you don't have to address that separate from the actual numerical impact on elections, I think that's a way that undermines confidence in the elections. So whether it's proving citizenship, ID, et cetera, don't you think that that's part of the defending the democracy credibility project?
Michael, you're absolutely correct. And in this point, I would say there are two words that always need to be remembered, and that is common sense. I mean, this country is set up so that people who are citizens of this country get an opportunity to vote. John Sununu and Dick Swett each have an opportunity to vote. We may not always vote the same way, but by gosh, our votes are going to be counted. Right. And why are they counted? They're counted because we're both citizens of the United States of America. And if we're letting people go in and take ballots and cast votes who are not citizens, we are doing our own personal selves a disfavor, let alone our communities and our countries at large. So that's an important aspect that New Hampshire pays very close attention to. And I think we do it the right way here. We are commonsensically requiring people to demonstrate their citizenship. And if you're that intent on voting, which here we are in New Hampshire with 79% turnout, we are, by gosh, are very intent on voting. You need to take the time to make sure that your citizenship can be properly demonstrated and represented. And I think that that's the way the system ought to work, because at the end of the day, our most important accomplishment, if we're going to accomplish anything, is to increase and improve people's trust in the government. And that has to start out with a clear and undeniably sure electoral system, and you build from there.
So this is a completely nonpartisan conversation, but you are a member of the Democratic Party, and historically, Democrats have opposed, things like voter ID, et cetera, for all sorts of reasons. What would be your message to your fellow members of your party about connecting confidence and democracy together?
I can't say it enough, and I can't say it too many times. We won't have a government if we do not build confidence in our public's participation in that government. If we are allowing people to vote who cannot demonstrate their citizenship, I think that it does a great damage to the integrity of our entire system. If we're going to build that confidence and we're going to have that ability to demonstrate citizenship, we got to do everything in our means possible to make people able to demonstrate that in a clear and undeniable way. And whether that's through documents that the government issues that declare citizenship, the new driver's license with the star on them, that the real ID approach, or however other ways. There are a number of choices that people have that they can take to the town hall to demonstrate their citizenship and get on the voting rolls. That's something that we as citizens need to know about. So therefore, the education is important, and we need to act upon. Therefore, action must be taken as well.
Now, Senator Sununu, from a longtime political family, you've got to, I'm assuming you see the same thing I do, which is American voting is so much more secure than it was like 2 generations ago. I mean, it's almost ironic that we're having this conversation about lack of confidence in democracy. When I was a kid, you'd have voting booths down in South Carolina where they literally were handing out bottles of liquor and barbecue sandwiches outside in Charleston as part of the voting process. You think about Chicago and the old, how many votes you got? How many you need? Do you agree with me that, in fact, we're doing a good job? It's just there's a perception and confidence problem?
Yeah, so I think broadly you're correct. There were probably wider swaths of America where fraud was unfortunately much more common than it is today. But at the same time, when we have technology and communication systems that can deliver so much transparency and integrity, the expectations are that we should have that everywhere, right? So, as Ambassador Swett pointed out, there are still parts of the country that lag behind. True, they may be better than Chicago in 1960, but that shouldn't be the bar, right? That shouldn't be the standard that we're holding anyone to in this country anymore. It's much higher than that, and voter expectations and what they want to see to help instill that confidence is rightfully much higher. And I can't agree more that, to me, that maybe the single biggest issue is the amount of time that it takes some states and districts to count their votes. Right. It boggles the mind in the 21st century that this is the case. And when you see a state like Florida or Wisconsin being able to complete their results in a very timely way, there's no reason that Arizona and California shouldn't be able to do exactly the same thing. And I look at that we're not calling as an organization. We don't call for legislation here or there. I'm simply observing, having talked to a lot of voters, having worked on these issues for some time now. That's the one that I think the country needs to work hardest to resolve.
And that's a scale issue. In New Hampshire, we do it by midnight because we have enough counters who can do the counting and we can get the votes counted and done. But as the senator just pointed out, Florida, one of the third largest state in the country, they are able to do it just the same. And how do they make that possible? They have the people in the numbers that are necessary to make the counting accurate and complete by the time the clock strikes 12. So that's such an important part of this whole process. And as we keep repeating, having people's confidence in their processes, in their governmental processes from elections to legislation, all of that is so important.
It's so funny. I have pushback from other states when I brag about New Hampshire, and they're like, well, you're a small state. I'm like, a precinct's a precinct.
That's
precincts
right.
are all the same size. California has a gazillion precincts. We have 1,000 precincts, but it's a precinct is a precinct.
And we have precincts with 10,000 voters.
Exactly.
Or 15,000 voters. I mean, in my day, I think Derry might have been the largest in the state. I don't know which one is the largest in the state today for sure, but they're not small. And in fact, but my guess is part of the problem in some states is that their precincts are too small,
right?
Not too large. So it's a matter of getting your process right. The things we talked about, training and transparency and organization, and it can be done.
So let me wrap up with this. There's an argument that goes like this. The real issue about confidence in democracy is, did I win? And when I win, it works great. And when the other guy wins, it's terrible. So it's awful. You both, I used to run campaigns. And the thing about it is very exciting because when you won, it tasted so good. When you lost, it felt so bad. So you get why people would want to blame the system. You both have gone through the process of losing an election. And I was wondering if I could get each one of you, starting with you, Ambassador Swett, to talk about that experience and what you took away from it and how you think it applies to restoring our confidence, our democracy.
Well, I can give you a very good example. In '96, I ran for the Senate, and I was running against incumbent Senator Bob Smith. And 3 hours before the polls were closed, they were announcing me on the 4 major networks that I was going to win based on exit polling. And the whole cabinet called, the president, vice president, everybody down the line called to congratulate me. And I said, wait a minute, gentlemen, this is not over, because in New Hampshire, the conservative vote comes in late because it's coming in from all the small communities. It comes in by midnight, but it comes in later in the evening than the urban votes. And sure enough, I went to bed thinking I was the winner and woke up having lost by a very narrow percentage margin. That was very painful, but it changed how election, especially exit polling, is announced now. You can't announce exit poll results until after the polls have closed. And I could have complained. I could have said, that this was rigged. Somebody had done this in such a way that it got more Republicans out in the last 3 hours because they knew that they were not polling well at the exits. That wasn't necessary. That wasn't going to improve the outcome of the election in my mind. And so that was a very painful experience for me. But it was one that taught me, at least, look, we're trying to fix it so that we can't make announcements of what the exit polls are until after the polls have closed.
Senator?
It's funny. My experience when I lost was different, but in a similar way reflected my confidence and the process here in New Hampshire. After the polls closed, I stopped at my house very briefly before going over to our celebration area, and I got returns from 3 or 4 towns. And these were actually towns I won. With Lakes Region, Carroll County, and looked at the margins, looked at my expectations, and realized I'm not going to win this election. And I probably had 5 or 7 towns, but I knew these results are correct. This is the way this town voted this year. This is the way they might have voted 4 years, 6 years, 8 years before. And I ended up, losing by maybe 6 or 7%. It wasn't a washout by any stretch, but I could tell. And because I had confidence in those numbers, I went over to the area. I think I conceded at 8:30 before anyone had called the race in America. Sure. But it was just the right thing to do. It wasn't about me. It was about the process. And my opponent had every right to, celebrate as long as they wanted because Governor Shaheen had won. So, it might have been one of the earliest concessions on record in a New Hampshire U.S. Senate race. But, I looked at the numbers and they were what they were. Yeah.
Well, like I say, in America, anyone can run for office, and you two certainly prove that. So, no, I'm kidding. I mean, I really do seriously appreciate your time and the work that you're doing at this time of great turmoil. And I agree with the people who say the New Hampshire model should be the national model. It's the right way to do it. And people can learn lessons. For people who want to learn more about your project, where can they find you?
They can find us at the Democracy Defense Project online. We have a website. We have a lot of web pages that describe how this is being done in various states. We look for people's support. We are very appreciative of your talking with us, Michael. Keep this subject front and center before the American public. It's a very important one, and we'll keep it from our end going as loud and as consistently long as we possibly can.
And just checking, neither of you is announcing today you're running for U.S. Senate.
I don't believe
me.
Just double checking. Okay, that makes 3 of us. Thank you so much for joining us and being part of Up to Speed. We really appreciate your time. For more information, you can always find us at New Hampshire Journal, NHJournal.com.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
This Up to Speed podcast is made possible by Legislative Solutions. Legislative Solutions knows New Hampshire's politics inside and out. With years of experience and a results-driven approach, they're the go-to team for anyone looking to make an impact at the State House. Find them at legislative-solutions.com.